Look at these delicate hands. They are completely useless for hard labor, absolutely useless on a frontier ranch, and a total burden to our proud family. The cruel voice of Arthur sliced through the heavy, sweltering air of the train station, sharp enough to cut bone. The hot wind whipped the frayed hem of the faded morning dress of Evelyn. The acrid bite of coal smoke from the departing locomotive burned her lungs, mixing with the sharp smell of hot iron and dry earth. The harsh glare of the midday sun illuminated the deep, grief-stricken circles beneath her hazel eyes. She stood entirely frozen on the splintered wooden platform, a solitary figure surrounded by the bustling chaos of the frontier town. The people gathered near the ticket counter turned their heads to watch the humiliation of the young widow. But the truth of this dusty afternoon was far more complicated than anyone on that platform imagined. The destiny of this fragile woman was not a tragic end, but a magnificent beginning. Stay with me until the end of this tale. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The brother of her late husband threw a battered leather trunk at her feet. It landed with a hollow, tragic thud. A thick cloud of gray dust plumed into the stagnant air. Evelyn flinched. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She curled her pale, trembling fingers inward. She actively hid her hands within the protective folds of her charcoal wool shawl. It was the desperate, defensive posture of a woman struck down by cruel words far too many times. The world can be a brutal anvil. It often attempts to forge human souls through heavy, unforgiving strikes. Many people look at a fragile porcelain teacup and see only a weakness waiting to shatter under the weight of a heavy boot. But the men who have survived the deepest, most isolating wilderness know a completely different truth. They know true strength does not always roar with the terrifying fury of a winter storm. Sometimes, the most profound strength is the quiet, invisible courage required to simply remain standing. When the earth fractures beneath your feet. Evelyn had lost her husband to a sudden winter fever only 3 months prior. Since that dark day, the family of her departed spouse had stripped away her dignity piece by piece, treating her delicate nature as a sin rather than a grace. "We are entirely done with you." "Evelyn," sneered Arthur. "The train fare is paid in full. Go back east and find another fool to feed you." A massive shadow suddenly fell over the small frame of the widow. The blinding, harsh sunlight vanished in an instant. It was replaced by the towering silhouette of a rugged mountain man. He stepped heavily off the wooden boardwalk. He positioned his immense body directly between Evelyn and the cruel sneer of Arthur. The stranger was a giant made of weathered canvas, thick denim, and quiet authority. He stood well over 6 feet tall, possessing massive broad shoulders that effectively blocked the howling, dusty wind. A heavy canvas duster coat draped over his muscular frame. A wide-brimmed felt hat shadowed his piercing, intelligent gray eyes. The giant lowered his gaze to the trembling woman. He subtly shifted his stance. He created a physical barrier to shield her from the biting wind and the mocking stares of the gathered crowd. It was a silent, powerful movement of absolute protection. "You speak with an awful lot of noise for a man walking away," rumbled the deep voice of the giant. The tone was low, calm, and terrifyingly steady. Arthur took a nervous, stumbling step back, his bravado faltering against the sheer size of the stranger. "This is family business. Mountain man. She is a helpless leech. I am simply cutting the financial loss of my family." The towering stranger did not even look at Arthur. He kept his intense focus entirely fixed on the tear-streaked face of the widow. He slowly reached into the deep pocket of his coat. He offered a clean, rough cotton handkerchief. It was a quiet gesture of profound respect rather than cheap pity. Evelyn looked up. She saw an anchor in the middle of a terrifying storm. She accepted the folded cloth. Her delicate fingers brushed briefly against the thick, scarred knuckles of the giant. A spark of unexpected warmth blossomed deep within her chest, chasing away the icy grip of her humiliation. The frontier does not need another woman to swing a heavy axe, the stranger murmured. This wild land needs a heart that knows how to survive the winter. The giant turned his head slightly toward Arthur. The movement was slow and deliberate, radiating dangerous calm. The debt of the widow is settled, stated the mountain man. She belongs with me now. Arthur laughed. The sound was harsh, ugly, and entirely devoid of warmth. You are actually taking her? Good luck to you. She will freeze or starve before the snow falls. She cannot cook a proper camp meal. She cannot build a fence. And she is utterly useless on a working ranch. I have hands enough for the hard labor, the mountain man replied softly. I am in need of a loyal wife. And I am asking this beautiful woman for the profound honor of her hand. The giant knelt on one knee directly into the filthy dust of the train platform. He lowered his massive, intimidating frame before the discarded widow. He completely ignored the shocked gasps of the onlookers and the gaping mouth of Arthur. It was a breathtaking coronation in the dirt. He did not see a burden. He saw a queen waiting for her rightful crown. My name is Gideon, breathed the kneeling giant, his gray eyes locking onto the hazel eyes of Evelyn. I own the vast land at the base of the Weeping Peaks. Come with me. You will never know hunger, and no man will ever speak to you with disrespect again. You have my solemn vow. He stood. He effortlessly lifted the heavy leather trunk of the widow with one single hand. He treated the meager belongings of Evelyn as if they were chests filled with priceless gold. The crushing humiliation of Evelyn evaporated into the hot wind. Utter shock and cautious hope rushed into the empty space of her broken heart. The cruel taunts of Arthur faded entirely into the background noise of the busy station. She looked at the large, calloused hand offered by the mountain man. She gathered her remaining courage. She placed her delicate fingers into his massive palm. I will come with you. Gideon, she whispered. They walked together toward a heavy wooden wagon, waiting near the edge of the frontier town. The heavy, then, protective silence of the towering rancher felt safe, yet deeply mysterious. Evelyn sat carefully on the hard wooden bench. She clutched her charcoal shawl tightly around her thin shoulders. She watched the massive hands of her new protector expertly guide the powerful draft horses away from the station. The harsh town disappeared behind a thick cloud of rising dust. The vast, intimidating prairie stretched out before them, wild and untamed. A profound question continuously echoed within her racing mind. Why would a man who possessed the raw strength to conquer entire mountains lower himself into the dirt to claim a broken woman whom the rest of the world had discarded as worthless trash? The wooden wheels of the heavy wagon groaned a rhythmic, hypnotic melody against the rutted dirt of the prairie trail. The harsh afternoon sun slowly yielded to a bruising twilight of deep purple and burnt orange. The vast plains stretched endlessly in every direction, an intimidating ocean of dry grass and scattered sagebrush. Evelyn sat stiffly upon the hard wooden bench. She gripped the rough wool of her charcoal shawl. She kept her delicate pale fingers entirely hidden from the world. The silence stretching between the two travelers was profound. Back in the bustling cities of the East, silence usually meant anger. The silence of her former family had always been a weapon, loaded with unsaid insults and suffocating judgment. But the quiet of this towering mountain man felt completely different. The silence of Gideon was the heavy, peaceful quiet of an ancient forest. It was a space waiting to be filled, rather than a wall meant to exclude. Yet, the lingering fear of the fragile widow refused to entirely release its icy grip upon her heart. She cast quick, stolen glances at the massive profile of the man sitting beside her. He held the thick leather reins of the draft horses with loose, effortless authority. His rugged, weather-beaten face gave away absolutely nothing. The deep scars on his strong knuckles told tales of harsh winters and physical pain. Yet those same hands guided the massive animals with surprising gentleness. Evelyn felt entirely inadequate. She possessed no practical skills for this harsh environment. She wondered if she had traded one form of captivity for another. "The air grows thin and cold as the trail climbs," murmured Gideon. His low voice rumbled like distant thunder across the quiet evening. He did not look at her. Instead, he reached behind the wooden bench with one massive arm. He retrieved a thick, heavy woolen blanket woven in deep crimson and forest green. With deliberate care, he draped the heavy fabric over the trembling shoulders of his new wife. He did not ask if she was cold. He simply observed her subtle shivers and provided the necessary warmth. The thick wool smelled of cedar wood and clean mountain air. Evelyn pulled the crimson edge of the blanket closer to her chin. The unexpected kindness brought a sudden, stinging pressure to her hazel eyes. The cruel sneers of Arthur echoed faintly within her memory, insisting she was a useless burden. Yet, this giant of a man treated her comfort as an absolute priority. "Thank you," she breathed. The words felt incredibly small against the vast emptiness of the wild landscape. Gideon gave a single, slow nod. He subtly shifted his massive frame slightly to the left. By moving just a few inches, his broad shoulders entirely blocked the biting crosswind sweeping down from the jagged peaks above. The harsh chill vanished from the face of Evelyn. The rhythmic swaying of the wooden wagon continued as the shadows lengthened across the trail. Evelyn watched the steady, calming hands of her protector. The deep fear tightening her chest slowly began to evolve into a quiet, watchful curiosity. Who was this stoic man? He lived completely alone in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet he possessed the gentle instinct to protect a fragile stranger from a simple evening breeze. The trail grew rougher as the heavy wheels crunched over loose mountain stones. A deep, jagged rut appeared suddenly in the path ahead. Gideon tightened his grip on the thick leather reins. He clicked his tongue sharply. He guided the heavy draft horses in a smooth, deliberate arc, completely avoiding the harsh bump that would have deeply jolted the delicate frame of his passenger. He prioritized her physical peace over the straightest path. It was a tiny, wordless act of devotion. Evelyn noticed the careful effort. The small, quiet gestures of the mountain man began to build a fragile foundation of trust within her broken spirit. She was no longer simply waiting for the next cruel insult. She was beginning to observe the quiet honor of the giant sitting beside her. The sky deepened into a stunning canvas of bruised indigo and sparkling silver. The stars of the high frontier burned with a fierce, clean light. The bitter pain of the widow felt remarkably distant under such a massive, indifferent sky. The wilderness did not care about the fine embroidery of a dress. Nor did the wild mountains care about the social standing of a family name. The frontier only respected resilience. Perhaps, deep within the hidden corners of her soul, Evelyn possessed the exact type of resilience this wild land required. The deep well of her compassion had never been given a safe place to flow. Perhaps the isolated kingdom of this giant could become the sanctuary she desperately needed. "We are crossing the boundary line," stated Gideon. The low rumble of his voice broke the long silence. "The land of the weeping peaks begins here." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, peering into the growing darkness. The sweet scent of wild pine and damp earth rushed into her lungs. The flat, dusty prairie finally surrendered to the rising foothills of a massive mountain range. The air felt heavier, richer, and completely alive. A profound emotional reflection washed over the trembling widow. Belonging is rarely found in the places we are born. True belonging is often forged in the fires of unexpected kindness, carefully built piece by piece in the quiet spaces between two broken souls. For the first time in many agonizing months, Evelyn did not feel like discarded luggage. She felt like a traveler finally nearing a safe harbor. However, the comforting warmth of the heavy woolen blanket could not completely shield her from the intimidating reality of their destination. The heavy wagon crested a steep, rocky ridge. The draft horses snorted, their breath turning to thick white steam in the freezing mountain air. Below them, nestled deep within a switching valley of dark pine trees, sat the isolated estate of the mountain man. It was not a simple cabin. It was a sprawling, rough-hewn fortress of massive dark timber and river stone. The sheer scale of the ranch was breathtaking and entirely intimidating. The dark, even, imposing silhouette of the mountain ranch rose against the starlit sky, dominating the wild valley. No warm, welcoming glow spilled from the dark, shuttered windows. The massive structure stood in absolute, total darkness, radiating a raw, untamed energy. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built by a man determined to keep the entire world locked far away. The silent timber walls of the wild estate loomed over the valley, holding a heavy, measer, unspoken challenge for the delicate woman who now approached its heavy wooden doors. What dark, hidden ghosts paced the empty halls of that massive stone fortress? The heavy wooden wagon ground to a slow, creaking halt in the center of the dark courtyard. The descent into the hidden valley took the remaining breath of Evelyn. The massive house of river rock and thick timber loomed like a dormant beast beneath the canopy of silver stars. The structure possessed no welcoming glow. It radiated the harsh, unforgiving energy of a fortress built to withstand the brutal fury of the wild frontier. The sharp, bitter cold of the high altitude bit deeply through the heavy crimson blanket. The harsh wind carried the vivid scent of crushed pine needles, frozen earth, and raw, untamed wilderness. Evelyn sat frozen upon the wooden bench. She listened to the heavy, exhausted snorts of the draft horses. A rusted iron lantern flared to life near the wide doors of a sprawling barn. 3 rugged ranch workers stepped out from the deep shadows. The men wore heavy canvas coats and battered leather chaps. They stopped dead in their tracks. The eyes of the rough men widened in sheer disbelief as they stared at the wagon. They looked at the faded, charcoal morning dress of the new arrival. They scrutinized the delicate, pale features of her face. They saw her slender, fragile frame shivering in the mountain wind. A harsh, silent judgment passed instantly between the hardened workers. The unspoken verdict echoed loudly in the freezing air. This porcelain doll would shatter before the first heavy snow of the season. She was completely useless for the brutal demands of this isolated life. Evelyn felt the heavy weight of their skeptical stares. She immediately curled her trembling fingers inward. She pulled the edges of the thick wool tightly around her delicate shoulders. She actively hid her hands within the heavy folds of the blanket, returning to the defensive posture of a woman expecting cruel insults. Gideon observed the silent exchange. He saw the quiet panic rising within the hazel eyes of his new wife. He moved with sudden, deliberate speed. The towering mountain man stepped directly into the line of sight between the hardened workers and the fragile widow. His massive, broad shoulders entirely blocked the harsh scrutiny of the men. "Tend the team," rumbled the voice of the giant. The command was low, quiet, and vibrated with absolute authority. The three men swallowed hard, nodded quickly, and hurried toward the massive horses. Gideon turned his attention back to Evelyn. The dangerous edge in his posture vanished entirely. He reached up toward the high wooden bench. His massive, calloused hands spanned her narrow waist. He lifted her from the wagon as if she weighed absolutely nothing. He set her down upon the frosted earth with immense care, ensuring her worn leather boots found a solid, safe footing before he released his gentle hold. It was a profound physical reassurance. Gideon retrieved a heavy brass key from the deep pocket of his duster coat. He escorted Evelyn up the wide, groaning wooden steps of the front porch. The heavy oak door swung inward with a long, mournful creak. The air inside the vast estate was stale and freezing. It smelled strongly of cold ash, cured leather, and lonely years. Gideon struck a match against the stone wall. He lit a kerosene lamp sitting upon a small table. The warm, golden glow pushed the heavy shadows into the far corners of the great room, revealing the raw truth of the rugged kingdom. The sheer scale of the interior was breathtaking, yet it was entirely devoid of comfort. A massive hearth of river rock dominated the far wall. The furniture consisted of heavy, raw timber and thick animal hides. There were no soft woven rugs upon the scratched wooden floorboards. There were no delicate curtains to soften the harsh, square edges of the dark windows. Dust coated the empty wooden shelves. It was a place of rough survival, completely lacking the gentle touch of a woman. The crushing weight of her own inadequacy pressed heavily upon the fragile chest of Evelyn. She possessed no physical strength to chop the massive logs piled near the door. She lacked the hardened muscles required to lift the heavy iron cauldrons sitting cold upon the massive stove. She felt like a delicate ghost haunting a kingdom of giants. However, as she stared at the cold, empty hearth, a profound emotional reflection stirred deep within her broken spirit. A house built of massive stones remains a cold fortress until a fire is lit within the center. True warmth does not come from thick timber or heavy iron. True warmth comes from the quiet, persistent care of a willing soul. The hardened workers outside saw only a useless, fragile woman. But Evelyn looked at the vast, dusty room and saw a massive, empty canvas waiting for the brush of a gentle heart. The cruel family of her late husband threw her away because she could not swing an axe or pull a plow. But a home does not need an axe to find peace. It needs a devoted caretaker. The deep isolation freezing her heart slowly shifted. A quiet, not fierce determination began to root itself deep within her fragile chest. She would prove her absolute worth to this towering protector. She would transform this rough kingdom into a sanctuary. Gideon walked straight to the massive stone hearth. He knelt upon the cold floorboards. He arranged dry kindling with practiced precision and struck another match. The fire flared brilliantly. The golden light danced across the harsh, rugged lines of his weather-beaten face. He stood and pulled a heavy wooden rocking chair much closer to the rising warmth of the flames. "Sit," breathed the mountain man. Gesturing to the chair, Evelyn moved toward the fire. The immediate heat began to thaw the deep chill in her bones. Gideon vanished into the dark shadows of the kitchen area. He returned a few moments later, holding a chipped blue enamel mug. A thin ribbon of fragrant steam rose from the rim. "Wild mountain peppermint," murmured Gideon. It chases away the bitter frost. He placed the warm mug gently into the pale hands of Evelyn. As she took the drink, his scarred, new, calloused fingers lingered against her skin for a fraction of a second. The brief touch transferred a solid, grounding heat to her trembling hands. It was a silent, powerful promise of continuous safety. "I must secure the heavy doors of the barn," stated the giant. He pulled his wide-brimmed felt hat down low over his eyes. "The house is entirely yours to command. You are safe here." He stepped out into the freezing night, pulling the heavy oak door completely shut behind him. Evelyn sat alone in the quiet, rough kingdom. She sipped the hot peppermint tea. The sweet warmth bloomed in her stomach, bringing a rush of genuine comfort. She placed the empty blue mug upon a heavy wooden table. She lifted the kerosene lamp by its brass handle. She decided to explore the dark, silent hallways of her new home. The thick wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath her careful steps. She passed 3 empty rooms. They held only thick dust, broken wooden chairs, and heavy shadows. However, at the very end of the long, dark corridor, the flickering light of her kerosene lamp illuminated a heavy, isolated oak door. Unlike every other entrance in the sprawling house, this specific door featured a large, gleaming brass lock. The metal keyhole looked completely free of dust, indicating very frequent use. The wood surrounding the lock showed the polished wear of a heavy hand. Evelyn reached out with pale, trembling fingers. She grasped the cold iron handle. She pushed, gently. The heavy handle did not yield a single inch. The room was locked tight against the entire world. What dark, hidden ghosts did the stoic mountain man keep secured at the end of the dark hall? The cold morning sun offered a pale, fragile light but zero heat to the wild valley. The heavy oak door of the locked room remained a silent mystery in the mind of the widow. But the harsh demands of the frontier morning quickly demanded her full attention. Evelyn smoothed the wrinkled fabric of her faded morning dress. She wrapped the charcoal wool shawl tightly around her slender shoulders. She stepped onto the frosted wooden porch, her breath forming small clouds of white steam in the freezing air. The vast courtyard of the estate was already alive with brutal labor. 3 rugged ranch workers were chopping massive logs of firewood and hauling heavy wooden buckets of water from the deep stone well. The loud, rhythmic sound of axes striking timber echoed loudly against the jagged walls of the weeping peaks. Evelyn watched the men from the shadows of the porch. A deep, agonizing knot of insecurity tightened within her chest. The cruel insults of her former family continued to echo within her memory, insisting she was a completely useless burden. She possessed a desperate, overwhelming need to prove her worth to the towering mountain man who had saved her from total ruin. Evelyn descended the groaning wooden steps. She walked carefully across the frozen, rutted earth toward the massive stone well. The youngest ranch hand, a harsh-faced man bearing a long scar across his chin, had just filled 2 massive wooden buckets with freezing well water. He dropped the heavy hemp rope and turned away to assist with the restless draft horses. Evelyn approached the wooden buckets. She wanted to contribute to the survival of the ranch. She wanted to earn her place in this rough kingdom. She reached down with her delicate, pale hands and grasped the thick iron handle of the nearest bucket. The metal was brutally cold. It bit instantly into her soft skin like a row of sharp teeth. Evelyn braced her slender frame. She pulled upward with all the fragile strength she possessed. The massive bucket barely lifted an inch from the frosted dirt. The coarse grain of the iron handle scraped viciously against her palms. Her delicate shoulders screamed in sudden, searing pain from the sheer, impossible weight of the water. Her grip faltered instantly. The heavy wooden bucket crashed back against the frozen earth with a violent thud. The icy water sloshed aggressively over the heavy wooden rim, soaking the worn leather of her boots and the frayed hem of her charcoal dress. The bitter cold of the water shocked her system. The loud splash drew the immediate attention of the busy ranch hands. The loud thud of the chopping axes ceased entirely. The youngest worker turned around. He looked at the spilled water, and then he looked at the trembling, slender frame of the widow. A harsh, ugly sneer twisted his scarred face. "Just like we figured last night," muttered the scarred worker, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "The delicate porcelain doll cannot even water a single horse. She is completely useless out here. We will be doing her share of the chores before the first snow falls." The cruel, mocking laughter of the other men followed his harsh words. The laughter struck the fragile heart of Evelyn like physical blows. The deep humiliation of the train station rushed back with terrifying force. She immediately curled her trembling fingers inward, actively hiding her stinging red palms within the protective folds of her charcoal shawl. She lowered her chin, staring blindly at the frozen mud. The bitter, suffocating taste of absolute failure flooded her mouth. She was entirely inadequate for this wild land. Suddenly, the heavy, terrifying silence of the mountain man blanketed the courtyard. Gideon stepped out from the deep shadows of the sprawling barn. He moved with the slow, dangerous grace of a massive predator. His wide-brimmed felt hat shadowed his piercing gray eyes. But the absolute, towering fury radiating from his massive frame was unmistakable. He walked directly toward the laughing workers. The heavy thud of his leather boots against the frozen earth sounded like an approaching avalanche. The younger man stumbled backward. His mocking smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "You will hold your tongue," rumbled the low, vibrating voice of Gideon. The tone lacked any shouting, yet it carried the devastating, undeniable force of a falling mountain. "You will look at the dirt when you speak of her." Gideon turned his massive, broad shoulders. He completely blocked the harsh stares of the terrified men, creating an impenetrable wall of physical protection between the fragile widow and the cruel judgment of the world. He knelt slightly, bringing his rugged, weather-beaten face level with the tear-filled hazel eyes of Evelyn. He did not chastise her foolish attempt at heavy labor. He did not show a single ounce of disappointment. Instead, he gently reached out. He took the trembling, hidden hands of his new wife. He slowly uncurled her delicate fingers. He inspected the angry red marks left by the brutal iron handle. His calloused, scarred thumbs brushed against her soft, stinging skin with unbelievable tenderness. It was a stunning contrast of massive strength and delicate care. "These hands were not made for heavy iron and rough rope," breathed the giant, his gray eyes softening entirely as he looked at her. "They were made to bring grace to a wild, unforgiving place." Gideon pulled off his own thick, fleece-lined leather work gloves. He carefully slipped the massive, warm gloves over the freezing, aching hands of Evelyn. The residual heat of the giant immediately seeped into her aching bones, chasing away the bitter frost of the morning. The mountain man stood to his full, intimidating height. He placed one massive hand gently against the center of her back. The physical touch was a solid, grounding anchor of undeniable support. He turned his fierce gaze back to the trembling ranch hands. "This woman is the absolute heart of this estate," stated Gideon, his voice echoing with fierce authority across the frosted courtyard. "She is the queen of this valley. If a single man disrespects her again, He will walk off this mountain without his boots and without his coat. Is that completely understood? The rough men nodded frantically, their eyes fixed firmly upon the frozen dirt. They rushed back to their heavy labor in complete, terrified silence. The deep public embarrassment of Evelyn evaporated into the thin mountain air. A profound, overwhelming sense of emotional safety rushed into her broken soul. She looked up at the stoic profile of her protector. He did not view her physical failure as a profound weakness. He viewed her inherent dignity as a sacred treasure requiring his absolute, unwavering defense. We spend so much of our weary lives desperately trying to hide our perceived weaknesses, terrified of the brutal judgment of an unforgiving world. Yet, profound love does not demand flawless, rugged strength. Profound love stands firmly in front of our deepest inadequacies, shields us from the mocking laughter of the crowd, and declares us entirely worthy of absolute protection. True dignity is not found in never dropping the heavy bucket. True dignity is found in the massive, gentle hands that reach down to warm your freezing fingers after you fall. Gideon guided her gently back toward the warmth of the stone house. The harsh labor belongs to the men. Evelyn, you will find your own quiet purpose in due time. The quiet reassurance settled deep within her trembling chest. However, now, the temporary peace of the protected courtyard was suddenly broken by a drastic, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The pale morning sun vanished entirely. A thick, unnatural darkness swallowed the jagged peaks of the mountains. The sharp scent of damp earth was instantly replaced by the terrifying, metallic smell of heavy ice. A brutal, howling wind violently tore across the open valley, violently rattling the heavy timber of the barn. The temperature plummeted in a matter of seconds. A severe, unexpected winter storm rapidly descended upon the isolated mountain valley, carrying the furious, deadly threat of an unforgiving whiteout. The fury of the whiteout hit the hidden valley with the brutal force of a swinging iron hammer. The heavy timber of the vast house shuddered violently under the sudden assault of the howling wind. Thick, blinding sheets of snow erased the entire world beyond the thick glass of the dark windows. Within mere minutes, the sprawling courtyard vanished beneath a rising sea of freezing white. The heavy oak door of the great room burst open with a massive crash. The three rugged ranch workers stumbled over the threshold, entirely covered in a thick layer of ice and snow. Gideon followed immediately behind them, using his massive, broad shoulders to force the heavy door completely shut against the screaming gale. The immediate silence of the room was a stark, jarring contrast to the terrifying chaos of the storm outside. However, the relief of safety shattered instantly. The youngest worker, Watt, the very same man bearing the long scar across his chin who had mocked the widow only hours before, collapsed onto the rough wooden floorboards. He did not brace his fall. He simply crumbled like a severed puppet. The heavy thud of his body against the timber echoed loudly in the cavernous room. The other men rushed to his side. They stripped away his heavy canvas coat and his soaked leather chaps. The face of the scarred youth was no longer flushed with the harsh, biting cold of the winter air. Instead, his skin burned with a terrifying, unnatural heat. He thrashed weakly against the wooden floorboards, his breath rattling violently within his chest. A sudden, vicious winter fever had taken complete hold of his exhausted body. Gideon knelt beside the trembling youth. The towering mountain man possessed the immense physical strength required to build entire structures from raw timber. He possessed the courage to tame wild, unbroken draft horses. Yet, as he stared down at the burning face of his fallen worker, the giant was completely powerless. Raw muscle and fierce bravery are utterly useless against the invisible, silent strike of a deadly sickness. The rugged men of the ranch stood frozen in helpless terror, waiting for the shadow of death to claim their young friend. Evelyn watched the terrifying scene from the edges of the golden firelight. For a fleeting second, the cruel voices of her former family whispered in her memory, insisting she was weak, useless, and incapable of contributing to the survival of a harsh frontier. She looked down at her delicate, pale fingers. She felt the lingering, dull ache from the heavy iron handle of the water bucket. Then, she unclasped her hands. Evelyn deliberately dropped the thick charcoal wool shawl from her slender shoulders. She actively abandoned the defensive, hidden posture of a frightened victim. She walked with quiet, absolute purpose toward the center of the frantic room. She did not ask for permission to intervene. She simply stepped into the space where massive strength had failed. "Move away from him," commanded the widow. Her voice was not loud, but it resonated with a crystal clear, unwavering authority that demanded immediate obedience. The rough men parted instantly, stepping back into the deep shadows. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside the thrashing youth. She placed the back of her delicate hand against his sweat-drenched forehead. The heat radiating from his skin was terrifying, a raging fire threatening to consume him from within. "Bring my leather trunk from the corner," instructed Evelyn, turning her intense gaze toward the towering giant. "Fetch a large iron basin of clean snow from the windowsill, and boil a small kettle of water over the hearth fire immediately." Gideon did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The master of the massive estate moved with stunning, silent speed to obey the absolute commands of the fragile widow. He fetched the battered leather trunk, placing it gently beside her knees. He gathered the snow. He stoked the roaring flames of the hearth. He provided every single item she requested, his actions reflecting a profound, unspoken respect for her sudden authority. Evelyn opened the brass latches of her trunk. She entirely bypassed the folded mourning dresses and the meager keepsakes of her past. She reached deep into the bottom corner, retrieving a small, tightly wrapped bundle of rough muslin cloth. She unwrapped the fabric with practiced, graceful movements, revealing an array of dried roots, dark leaves, and potent herbs. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the delicate fingers they had so recently mocked moved with incredible, life-saving precision. Evelyn crushed dried willow bark into a fine powder using the back of a heavy wooden spoon. She mixed the bitter powder with sweet meadowsweet and sharp, fragrant peppermint leaves. She poured the boiling water over the mixture, releasing a thick, medicinal vapor into the stagnant air of the great room. The vivid, earthy scent of the crushed herbs mixed heavily with the smell of wood smoke and cold sweat, anchoring the desperate moment in stark reality. For the next 4 hours, the raging storm outside became nothing more than distant background noise. Evelyn fought a quiet, relentless war beside the roaring hearth. She continuously bathed the burning face of the scarred youth with icy rags formed from the melting snow. She carefully forced the bitter, life-saving herbal tea between his parched, cracked lips. She whispered calm, soothing reassurances into the quiet air whenever his body thrashed in the terrifying grip of the fever dreams. This world constantly measures strength by the ability to inflict force upon the earth. Men build massive walls to keep out the biting wind, and they forge heavy iron to conquer the wild landscape. But true survival requires an entirely different kind of power. Raw muscle can construct a mighty fortress, but only careful, tender knowledge can chase away the shadow of death from a fevered brow. Homemaking and quiet nurturing are not delicate weaknesses. They are the profound, sacred acts that actually keep the human soul tethered to the fragile body. Slowly, as the deep hours of the freezing night crawled toward dawn, the heavy, rattling breaths of the young worker began to ease. The terrifying, unnatural heat radiating from his skin finally broke, replaced by a cooling, healing sweat. His frantic thrashing ceased entirely. He sank into a deep, peaceful, restorative sleep. The battle was won. Evelyn sat back upon her worn leather boots. She wiped a stray lock of chestnut hair from her damp, exhausted face. Her soft hands were stained brown from the potent bark, and her delicate shoulders ached with a deep, consuming exhaustion. Yet, a profound, undeniable warmth bloomed completely through her chest. The crushing feelings of deep uselessness evaporated completely into the quiet air. She had saved a life. She had earned her absolute place within this wild valley. The scarred youth slowly opened his heavy eyelids. He looked up at the exhausted face of the fragile woman he had openly mocked just hours before. The cruel sneer was entirely gone from his pale face, replaced by a look of sheer, overwhelming awe and deep shame. Thank you, ma'am, breathed the young man. His voice, a raw, broken whisper of absolute gratitude. You saved me. Evelyn offered a soft, tired smile. She placed a gentle, reassuring hand upon his shoulder. Rest now. The worst of the storm has passed. She slowly stood to her feet, her slender frame swaying slightly from the immense exertion of the long night. As she turned toward the heavy timber table to gather her herbal supplies, she felt the intense, burning weight of a heavy stare. Gideon stood perfectly still in the deep shadows near the massive stone hearth. The golden firelight flickered across the rugged, harsh lines of his weather-beaten face. The towering mountain man was staring at her. He was not looking at her faded charcoal morning dress, nor was he looking at her delicate, stained hands. He was looking directly into her weary hazel eyes. The stoic, impenetrable expression of the giant had vanished completely. The piercing gray eyes of Gideon held an entirely new, deeply intense, and completely unreadable emotion as he watched the fragile widow command the space of his rugged kingdom. What profound realization was currently taking root within the heavily guarded heart of the silent protector? The brutal fury of the winter storm exhausted itself by the third morning. The heavy, now suffocating gray clouds broke apart, revealing a brilliant sky of crystal blue. The blinding morning sun struck the deep, unbroken snow of the valley, transforming the entire landscape into an ocean of glittering diamonds. The harsh, metallic scent of heavy ice surrendered to the clean, sharp ozone of melting snow and fresh pine. The heavy atmosphere inside the massive stone house had shifted completely. The agonizing tension of the first few days vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of shared survival. The scarred youth recovered his strength, and the demeanor of the ranch hands completely transformed. When Evelyn stepped onto the wide wooden porch, the rough men no longer stared with harsh judgment. They immediately removed their battered hats. They offered respectful nods. The youth with the scar even rushed forward to open the heavy barn doors for her, treating the fragile widow with the absolute reverence of a royal subject serving his queen. Evelyn no longer hid her pale hands within the folds of her charcoal shawl. The harsh red blisters left by the iron bucket handle were slowly fading into smooth, healed skin. She found a quiet purpose in the rough kingdom. She swept the wooden floorboards. She organized the massive pantry. She kept a steady, warm fire burning within the great stone hearth. Gideon observed every subtle change. The towering mountain man spoke very few words, but his silent devotion anchored the entire estate. He established a steady, comforting routine that entirely wrapped the fragile widow in undeniable emotional safety. Every morning after, before the pale sun crested the jagged mountain peaks, he left a steaming mug of wild peppermint tea upon the wooden table for her. He always ensured the heavy iron handle of the kettle was wrapped in a thick leather cloth, entirely protecting her delicate fingers from the burning heat. These quiet, consistent acts of profound care worked like gentle rain upon the parched, broken soil of her spirit. We often build massive, defensive fences around our hearts to keep out the brutal pain of the world. We assume isolation is the exact same thing as safety. But true emotional healing does not happen behind locked doors. Healing happens when a gentle soul repeatedly proves they will never strike you when you lower your guard. The guarded comfort of Evelyn slowly deepened into genuine cooperation. She began to anticipate the heavy footfalls of the giant, finding deep peace in his towering presence instead of intimidation. One bright, crisp afternoon, the melting snow dripped musically from the heavy timber eaves. Gideon walked into the great room. He paused near the massive stone hearth. He removed his wide-brimmed felt hat. "Come with me," rumbled the low voice of the giant. Evelyn set aside her mending. She followed the massive frame of her protector, out the heavy oak door. Gideon led her to the southern side of the sprawling stone house, a protected alcove entirely shielded from the bitter northern winds. The bright sun pooled warmly in this quiet space. Sitting upon the sturdy wooden floorboards of the porch was a massive, rectangular garden box. Evelyn stopped in her tracks. The raised bed was crafted from deep, rich cedar wood. The construction was an absolute masterpiece of silent devotion. The mountain man had built the structure perfectly level with her waist, ensuring she would never need to bend or strain her delicate back to tend the soil. He had spent countless hours sanding every single wooden board until the cedar was entirely smooth to the touch, completely eliminating the risk of sharp splinters piercing her soft hands. Inside the deep wooden box, thick, dark earth rested warmly in the sunlight. Gideon had hauled the frozen dirt from the valley floor and thawed it near the roaring hearth, preparing a perfect, rich bed for early spring seeds. Gideon stood beside the beautiful creation. He looked at the stunned, wide eyes of Evelyn. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas duster coat. He produced a small canvas pouch filled with tiny dried seeds. "You cannot swing an axe, and you should never lift heavy iron," murmured the giant, his gray eyes holding a profound, gentle warmth. "But this wild earth needs your quiet care. The harsh labor belongs to me. The growth belongs to you." He offered the small canvas pouch. Evelyn reached out with trembling fingers. She took the tiny seeds. Her soft fingertips brushed against the scarred, rough knuckles of the mountain man. A bright, undeniable spark of profound connection passed between them, tightening her chest with an unexpected rush of emotion. The tears of Evelyn spilled silently over her pale cheeks. They were not tears of deep humiliation or crushing grief. They were tears of overwhelming, absolute gratitude. The cruel family of her departed husband saw her delicate nature as a worthless burden. But this stoic mountain man observed her fragility, recognized her deep need to nurture life, and built a protected sanctuary specifically designed for her soft hands. "It is incredibly beautiful." "Gideon," breathed Evelyn. Her voice trembled with raw emotion. "Thank you." The giant gave a single, slow nod. The harsh lines of his weather-beaten face softened entirely. The budding trust between the broken widow and the silent protector blossomed in the bright afternoon sun, establishing roots far stronger than the thick timber of the estate. However, the deep peace of the isolated valley was fragile. The frontier is a wild place, but the long and dark reach of the past is often far more dangerous than any winter storm. The rhythmic hapushma, heavy sound of a laboring horse, echoed sharply through the quiet, melting valley. Gideon turned his massive, broad shoulders toward the main trail. Evelyn followed his intense gaze. A solitary rider slowly navigated the muddy, rutted path leading to the sprawling courtyard. The dark horse was completely exhausted, its sides heaving heavily under a thick layer of white foam and dark mud. The rider pulled the reins, stopping the weary beast near the edge of the porch. The man wore the crisp, dark uniform of an official city courier. He reached into the leather saddlebag, resting against the flank of the horse. He withdrew a thick, heavy envelope, crafted of expensive cream parchment. "I hold an urgent legal dispatch for the widow Evelyn," stated the courier. His voice carried a harsh, official tone that shattered the beautiful peace of the afternoon. He held the heavy envelope out toward the towering mountain man. Gideon took the dispatch. He looked down at the paper. The face of the giant instantly hardened into a terrifying mask of pure, dangerous stone. Evelyn felt a sudden, icy drop in her stomach. She looked at the back of the envelope. Pressed firmly into the center of the paper was a large, dark crimson wax seal. The seal bore the intricate, undeniable crest of her former family. The cruel ghosts of her past had found her hidden sanctuary. What terrible demand did the dark, heavy letter hold? The heavy cream parchment felt like a slab of cold iron in the trembling hands of Evelyn. The sharp, bitter wind of the high prairie suddenly returned, slicing through the gentle warmth of the spring afternoon. Gideon stood absolutely still beside the cedar garden box. His massive frame radiated a silent, terrifying tension. The towering mountain man did not take his piercing gray eyes off the dark, crimson wax seal resting against the pale fingers of his wife. Evelyn broke the seal. The brittle, dry snap of the thick wax sounded exactly like a fracturing bone in the quiet air of the valley. She unfolded the heavy paper. The elegant, sweeping handwriting of Arthur filled the page, yet the beautiful ink carried nothing but ugly venom. As her hazel eyes scanned the harsh words, the blood completely drained from the delicate face of the fragile widow. The crushing weight of her past rushed forward to entirely swallow her new sanctuary. A distant aunt from the east had passed away, leaving a vast, staggering fortune entirely in the name of Evelyn. The cruel family of her departed husband, the very same people who had mocked her delicate nature and discarded her at the dusty train station, had discovered the massive inheritance. Greed is a terrifying, consuming poison. It entirely rots the foundation of human decency. The family that threw her away when she was a penniless burden now desperately wanted her back to seize the immense wealth. The letter contained a formal, aggressive legal declaration. Arthur had filed a petition with the territorial courts. He claimed the fragile widow was mentally unfit to manage such a vast fortune due to her profound grief. Furthermore, he claimed the towering mountain man had violently coerced the delicate woman into a hasty, illegal marriage of convenience to steal the inheritance. The paper slipped from the trembling fingers of Evelyn. It fluttered to the wooden floorboards of the porch like a dying white bird. She immediately curled her pale fingers inward. The deep, agonizing panic of a cornered animal seized her chest. She reached for the heavy folds of her charcoal shawl, desperately wanting to hide her shaking hands from the harsh judgment of the entire world. Betrayal by blood is the deepest wound a human soul can endure. The people who are supposed to offer absolute protection are often the very ones who hold the sharpest blades. They did not care about her survival. They only cared about the gold attached to her name. Before she could bury her hands within the dark wool, massive, warm fingers gently intercepted her movement. Gideon did not look at the fallen letter. He looked directly into the terrified hazel eyes of Evelyn. He stepped close, using his massive broad shoulders to entirely block the view of the waiting courier. He enveloped her, trembling, cold hands within the profound, safe heat of his scarred palms. "Breathe the mountain air," rumbled the giant, his voice a steady, low anchor against the rising storm of her panic. "You are completely safe within this valley. Do not let the ghosts of your past steal the peace of your present." Evelyn gasped, pulling a ragged breath into her burning lungs. "They claim you forced me into this marriage. Gideon. They claim I am entirely broken and unable to make my own choices. They want to legally dissolve our union and drag me back to the city to take the money." The harsh lines of the weather-beaten face of the mountain man turned to solid, unyielding granite. A dangerous, protective fire ignited deep within his gray eyes. "They threw away a queen because they could not see her absolute worth," murmured Gideon, his rough thumbs slowly stroking the back of her soft hands. "I will burn this entire mountain to the ground before I let them drag you back into their darkness." He turned his fierce gaze toward the official courier, waiting upon the muddy horse. "Speak your business, and leave my land," commanded the giant. The courier swallowed hard, deeply intimidated by the raw, vibrating fury of the massive rancher. "I am merely the messenger. A territorial magistrate travels with the documents. The law states the magistrate must personally interview the bride to ensure the marriage is completely genuine and born of absolute devotion, not convenience or coercion. If the magistrate finds the union lacks deep affection, he possesses the legal authority to annul the marriage immediately and return the widow to the custody of her remaining family." The harsh reality of the legal threat crashed down upon the quiet porch. The profound paradigm shift occurred in a single heartbeat. Since the dusty afternoon at the train station, Gideon and Evelyn had maintained a polite, respectful distance. He gave her the master bedroom, while he slept on a small cot near the kitchen hearth. They shared quiet meals, gentle glances, and a growing, beautiful trust. But they behaved as careful friends sharing a massive fortress, not as passionate lovers consumed by absolute devotion. If the sharp-eyed legal magistrate observed their separate, sleeping arrangements, their polite distance, and the careful, formal way they spoke to one another, he would instantly declare the marriage a complete sham. "We must entirely abandon the polite distance," whispered Evelyn, her voice trembling with highly vulnerable reliance. "If we act like respectful strangers, they will take me away." Gideon slowly released her hands. He reached up with incredible gentleness. He used the rough pad of his scarred thumb to carefully wipe a single, stray tear from the pale cheek of the widow. The physical touch sent a sudden, wild flutter through the fragile chest of Evelyn. It was no longer a touch of simple protection. It was the bold, intimate touch of a devoted husband. "We will not act like strangers," stated Gideon. The low timbre of his voice vibrated with a completely new, intense energy. "We will show the magistrate the absolute truth. You are the sole heart of this estate. We will show him a bond they cannot break." Evelyn looked up at the towering giant. The terrifying panic began to shift into a profound, breathless reliance on the massive man standing before her. To survive this legal attack, they had to blur the strict lines between genuine duty and true love. They had to pretend to be deeply, madly consumed by one another. The very thought of sharing such profound, unguarded intimacy with the silent protector made her heart race with a complex mixture of absolute terror and undeniable, blooming hope. Gideon turned back toward the nervous courier. "When does the magistrate intend to arrive for this inspection?" demanded the mountain man. The courier gathered the heavy leather reins of his exhausted horse. He cast a fearful glance at the darkening sky above the jagged peaks. "The magistrate rests in the frontier town at the base of the mountain," replied the courier, turning the horse toward the muddy trail. "He rides at first light. He will arrive in your courtyard by dawn tomorrow." The heavy thud of the hooves faded into the melting valley. The crushing weight of the ticking clock pressed heavily upon the desperate couple. The sun was already sinking behind the tall pines. They possessed mere hours to transform from respectful strangers into a deeply passionate, devoted couple with absolutely no time to practice the intimate deception. How could the fragile widow convincingly portray a woman madly in love when she was completely terrified of her own awakening heart? The dawn arrived with the harsh, brilliant light of the high frontier. The pale morning sun washed over the deep snow of the valley, offering a cold beauty that completely failed to warm the frantic heart of Evelyn. She stood near the massive stone hearth. She listened to the heavy, rhythmic approach of a horse-drawn carriage. The magistrate had arrived. Evelyn smoothed the front of her faded charcoal morning dress. The familiar, deep panic flared within her fragile chest. She instantly curled her pale fingers inward. She reached for the heavy folds of her dark shawl to hide her trembling hands. However, before she could complete the defensive motion, the massive, warm hand of Gideon gently covered her own. He stood close beside her. The towering mountain man wore a clean white cotton shirt and a dark canvas vest. He smelled faintly of fresh pine and clean saddle leather. He slowly uncurled the delicate fingers of his wife. He did not speak a single word. He simply offered the profound, grounding heat of his scarred palm. The physical touch instantly steadied the chaotic racing of her pulse. The heavy oak door swung open. A thin, sharp-featured man stepped over the wooden threshold. He wore a pristine black suit that looked entirely out of place against the rough timber of the wild estate. He carried a heavy leather satchel. His dark eyes darted around the cavernous great room, absorbing every single detail with cold, calculating precision. "I am Magistrate Vance of the Territorial Court," announced the sharp man. His voice possessed the unpleasant, dry rustle of dead leaves. "I hold a formal petition to dissolve this union. I am here to uncover the truth of this sudden arrangement." Gideon did not flinch. He placed his massive, broad shoulders between the harsh stare of the official and the slender frame of Evelyn. It was his subtle, recurring posture of absolute protection. "You stand inside my home," rumbled the giant, his low voice vibrating with dangerous calm. "You will speak with absolute respect, or you will wait outside in the freezing mud." The sharp eyes of Vance narrowed. He stepped closer to the roaring hearth. "The family of the widow claims she is a fragile, broken prisoner. They claim she is entirely useless upon a working ranch. And you simply forced this marriage to secure the vast wealth attached to her name. Does this delicate creature truly survive here? Or is she merely a captive bird waiting for a rescue?" The anxious pretense of the morning threatened to crush the fragile breath of Evelyn. She prepared herself to speak, to offer a rehearsed lie about her profound happiness. But Gideon stepped forward. He did not allow her to defend her own honor. The mountain man turned his massive body. He looked down at the delicate face of his wife. The harsh, weather-beaten lines of his face melted completely. A profound, overwhelming warmth flooded his piercing gray eyes. "The people who discarded her are complete fools," breathed Gideon. His voice echoed through the quiet room with the raw, undeniable ring of absolute truth. They looked at a delicate flower and cursed it for not being a heavy iron hammer. They entirely failed to see her immense value. Gideon reached out. He gently took the pale hand of Evelyn. He raised her soft fingers toward the golden firelight. The magistrate watched the movement with intense scrutiny. These hands do not swing an axe, and they do not pull a heavy plow, continued the giant, his rough thumb carefully tracing the fading red marks left by the heavy water bucket. But these are the exact hands that brewed the potent medicine to break a deadly winter fever. These hands pulled one of my best men back from the dark edge of death when all my raw muscle was completely useless. She is not a burden to this vast land. She is the absolute salvation of it. The heart of Evelyn fluttered wildly against her ribs. The anxious pretense of the required performance blurred entirely into something profoundly real. The towering giant was not reciting a careful lie for the benefit of the sharp legal official. He was speaking the quiet, guarded truth of his own isolated soul. We often believe grand romantic declarations require practiced poetry or expensive gifts. But the most staggering romance is found when a protective soul looks at your deepest insecurities and publicly declares them to be your greatest strengths. To be fully seen and to be fiercely defended is the ultimate form of human devotion. I did not marry a prisoner, stated Gideon, turning his intense gaze back to the silent magistrate. The mountain man stood to his full, intimidating height. I crowned the true queen of the prairie. She is the sole heart of this wild valley. Every single man on this estate answers to her gentle voice. I would gladly burn my own massive fortress to the ground before I let anyone drag her back to the cruel darkness of her past. The profound silence of the great room was heavy and absolute. The sharp-featured official stared at the towering rancher in complete shock. The outsider came expecting to find a terrified victim and a cruel captor. Instead, he witnessed a magnificent, unbreakable reverence. The raw emotion radiating from the giant was impossible to fake. Evelyn looked up at the rugged profile of her protector. The deep, lingering self-doubt that had haunted her entire life evaporated into the warm air of the hearth. Genuine, breathtaking admiration filled her chest. She realized, in that quiet moment, that she was no longer pretending to be a devoted wife. She was rapidly falling in love with the silent protector, who treated her like absolute royalty. Magistrate Vance cleared his throat. The cold skepticism in his dark eyes had softened considerably. The words of a man are powerful, but the law requires complete proof of a shared life, muttered the official. He adjusted the heavy leather strap of his satchel. I must inspect the private living quarters of the estate. True devotion leaves an undeniable mark upon a home. The quiet panic returned instantly to the hazel eyes of Evelyn. She looked at Gideon. The mountain man offered a single, microscopic nod of reassurance. Vance walked past the massive stone hearth. He marched directly down the long, dark corridor. He opened the heavy oak door of the master bedroom. The room was beautiful and warm. It held the neat, folded garments of Evelyn, her small brass hairbrush, and the vivid scent of wild peppermint. The room clearly belonged to the cherished woman of the house. The official nodded in slow approval. The illusion of their deeply passionate marriage was holding strong. The wealth and freedom of the widow were nearly secured. However, as the sharp-eyed magistrate turned back toward the great room, he paused near the dark alcove adjacent to the kitchen area. The shadows were deep, but the morning light caught the edge of a small, rough wooden frame. Vance stepped into the alcove. He looked down. Tucked away in the freezing shadows, far removed from the warm comfort of the master bedroom, sat a narrow, uncomfortable military cot. Resting upon the thin mattress was the heavy canvas duster coat of the giant, folded neatly as a makeshift pillow. The truth of their separate nights was exposed in the cold morning light. The dark eyes of the magistrate narrowed once again. He turned slowly toward the frozen couple. The heavy silence of the mountain estate suddenly felt incredibly dangerous. How could they possibly explain the undeniable physical distance separating the king and queen of the prairie? The sharp, cold eyes of Magistrate Vance flickered back and forth between the narrow military cot in the shadowed alcove and the towering frame of Gideon. The profound silence of the great room stretched painfully thin, heavy with the terrifying possibility of an annulment. The sudden exposure of their separate sleeping arrangements threatened to tear away the fragile safety of the widow, dragging her back to the cruel city. This is the undeniable truth of a marriage built upon convenience, not deep affection, snapped the official, his dry voice slicing through the tense air like a rusted blade. The widow sleeps in the master chamber, while the master of the house retreats to a freezing cot in the dark. This union is a complete sham designed to seize the incoming inheritance. I will prepare the annulment documents immediately. Evelyn felt the blood drain completely from her face. The crushing weight of her desperate situation threatened to stop her breathing entirely. She could not go back to the cruel house of Arthur. She took a quick, stumbling step forward, prepared to humiliate herself, to beg the cold official for mercy. Before her delicate lips could form a single desperate word, a massive, calloused hand reached out. Gideon moved with deliberate, powerful grace. He placed his warm, scarred palm gently against the slender shoulder of his wife. The physical touch was no longer a simple gesture of public protection. It was an undeniable claim of absolute devotion. The mountain man did not cower. He did not offer a flimsy excuse to the sharp-eyed representative of the law. He turned his massive body. He looked directly into the hazel eyes of Evelyn. The piercing gray eyes of the giant held a sudden, raw, and completely unguarded vulnerability that stole the remaining breath from her chest. The military cot was not a rejection of her. Magistrate, rumbled the low voice of the giant. The tone did not possess his usual terrifying thunder. It was remarkably quiet, intimate, and heavy with profound personal history. That cot was a confession of my own deep fear. Vance paused, his dark eyes narrowing in confusion as he watched the towering mountain man lower his gaze. I built this wild estate from raw timber and blood after I lost everything to a bitter betrayal, murmured Gideon, his intense focus remaining entirely fixed upon the delicate, pale face of the trembling widow. The deep isolation of this mountain was my chosen shield. I swore to myself I would never allow another human soul to get close enough to break my heavily guarded heart. I brought this beautiful woman to my home because I could not stand the thought of a fragile soul being crushed by the cruel world. But I kept my distance during the dark hours of the night. I slept on the hard cot because I was absolutely terrified. Evelyn parted her lips slightly, a soft gasp escaping her throat. The deep, agonizing worry of the widow began to melt away, replaced by an overwhelming rush of intense longing and deep emotional safety. I was terrified that if I allowed myself to truly know the profound grace of her presence, I would become entirely dependent upon her, breathed the giant, the rough edges of his voice trembling with rare, absolute honesty. I was afraid of the terrifying fear of loss. I did not force her into this marriage to steal gold. I married her because the raw, empty spaces of this massive house were entirely meaningless until she arrived to bring true light to the valley. She is my absolute queen. I simply did not possess the courage to admit my desperate need for her love. The magistrate stared at the massive mountain man in absolute shock. The cold skepticism completely vanished from the face of the official. A man of raw muscle and fierce pride does not expose such deep, humiliating vulnerability merely to secure an inheritance. The raw truth of the words spoken by Gideon echoed with an authenticity that no court of law could ever deny. Evelyn felt the stinging pressure of hot tears spilling over her pale cheeks. The silent protector, the towering giant who conquered the wild landscape, was entirely devoted to her gentle spirit. He did not see her as a useless burden. He saw her as the very beating heart of his life. We spend so much of our weary lives hiding our deepest emotional wounds behind massive, impenetrable walls, terrified that admitting our need for another person makes us weak. Yet, true intimacy requires the absolute courage to step out of the shadows of our fear. Vulnerability is the ultimate key to human connection. Love does not belong to the flawless and the fearless. Love belongs to those who are willing to lay down their heavy armor and confess their desperate need to be healed by another soul. Gideon turned slowly back to face the legal representative of the territory. The towering rancher stood straight, radiating an open, profound dignity that demanded respect. "The law requires proof of a genuine marriage," stated Gideon, his gray eyes flashing with unwavering resolve. "The proof does not reside in where we lay our tired bodies when the sun goes down. The proof resides in the fact that we are entirely willing to change the very foundation of our lives to protect one another's peace. The deception ends today. I will no longer hide from the truth of my own heart." Gideon reached out. He took the delicate, trembling hand of Evelyn. With deliberate, sweeping movements, the mountain man walked toward the master bedroom. He did not hesitate. He picked up the folded blankets and the heavy canvas duster coat from the narrow military cot. He carried the humble bedding directly into the master chamber. He placed the duster coat upon the large wooden chest at the foot of the magnificent bed. He looked down at Evelyn. The forced intimacy of their deception had entirely melted away, replaced by a breathtaking, genuine emotional dependence. Magistrate Vance stood in the hallway, watching the quiet, profound action. The sharp official closed his heavy leather satchel. The cold, official mask slipped from his features, revealing a man deeply moved by the quiet power of redemption. "The territorial court requires no further proof," announced Vance, his dry voice carrying a genuine, respectful warmth as he looked at the couple. "This marriage is entirely genuine, born of profound mutual respect and undeniable devotion. I will file the finalized documents in the frontier town this evening. The vast inheritance is securely placed in the name of the widow, and no man will ever challenge this union again." The sharp-featured official turned, marched to the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the bright spring morning. The heavy carriage wheels groaned against the melting mud, carrying the last ghost of her past far away from the hidden valley. Evelyn stood inside the warm, sunlit master chamber. She was no longer the discarded, penniless widow trembling on a dusty train platform. She was the fiercely protected, deeply cherished queen of this wild land. She looked up at the towering mountain man, standing quietly before her. The physical proximity between them was intense, sparking a wild, beautiful longing within her fragile chest. The silent protector had lowered his massive walls, offering his entire heart to her careful care. However, as Evelyn took a slow, tentative step closer to the giant, a dark, chilling shadow of doubt flashed across her racing mind. The massive inheritance was now fully secured. The false debts and cruel threats of her former family were completely destroyed by the power of the law. A terrifying, agonizing thought suddenly tightened her stomach. did the towering mountain man finally lower his fierce defenses and confess his deep love, only because he knew the vast fortune was safely won. The journey to the frontier town for the annual spring fair felt entirely different from the day of the train station rescue. The heavy draft horses pulled the wagon with a steady, rhythmic pace, their hooves clattering against the dry, sun-baked earth. Evelyn sat upon the wooden bench, her heart fluttering with a nervous, unpredictable energy. Beside her, Gideon remained his stoic, towering self. Yet the subtle tension of the previous days had evaporated, replaced by a profound, magnetic awareness of one another. Every time the wagon lurched over a deep rut in the road, the shoulder of the mountain man brushed against the soft wool of her dress. Each accidental contact sent a rush of heat and long-buried longing through the chest of the widow. She was no longer simply his rescued ward. She was the woman who had seen the raw, unguarded vulnerability of his heart. And he was the man who had laid down his heavy armor to offer her his full devotion. The town was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of color and sound. Banners fluttered in the warm breeze, and the air carried the mouth-watering scent of roasting meat, sweet apples, and freshly cut hay. Farmers from the surrounding valleys gathered to trade, gossip, and showcase the fruits of their long winter labor. Gideon guided the horses to the edge of the central square. He climbed down from the high bench with his characteristic, effortless strength. He reached up to lift Evelyn, his large, scarred hands gripping her waist with a gentle, possessive familiarity that did not escape the notice of the passing townspeople as they walked toward the crowded exhibition tents. Evelyn felt the familiar, cold creeping of insecurity. She clutched her small woven satchel containing her entry for the craft competition, a collection of perfectly preserved, fragrant herbal salves and an intricately embroidered saddle blanket she had crafted during the long nights of the winter. She felt incredibly small amidst the tall, rugged men and the boisterous laughter of the crowd. Then, she saw them. Standing near the judging pavilion were Arthur and 3 other men from the wealthy family of her late husband. They looked entirely out of place in their tailored city coats and polished boots, their expressions twisted with sneering arrogance. Arthur caught sight of Evelyn, and a cruel, jagged smile spread across his face. "Look at this," called the brother-in-law, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding crowd. "The widow has decided to play pioneer. Do you truly expect the judges to honor that pathetic display of scraps? You were born for the parlor, not the prairie. You are nothing but a fragile, useless shadow, and even here, you are entirely out of your depth." The venom in the voice of the man stung the air. People turned to whisper, their eyes tracing the delicate, slender frame of Evelyn. She felt the old, suffocating shame begin to rise, the urge to hide her hands and retreat into the shadows of the giant beside her. Gideon stopped walking. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply turned, his massive, broad shoulders effectively shielding Evelyn from the harsh stares of the cruel men. He stood as an immovable, granite wall against their malice. "The lady is here to show her work," rumbled the voice of the mountain man. The low, rumbling tone carried across the square, silencing the scattered whispers of the crowd. "Your opinion holds absolutely no weight upon this ground." Evelyn looked up at the towering profile of her husband. She saw the fierce, absolute protection in his gray eyes. He did not need to fight for her. His mere presence was a shield that rendered their cruelty toothless. The suffocating shame began to dissipate, replaced by a steady, rising fire of dignity. She took a deep breath. She stepped forward, past the safety of his shadow, and presented her work to the panel of judges. The judges were hardened frontiersmen and women who valued utility, durability, and skill above all else. They examined the intricately embroidered saddle blanket. They smelled the sharp, clean potency of the herbal salves. They compared her work against the crude, heavy items presented by others. "This work is flawless," noted the lead judge, a woman with hands calloused from decades of homesteading. "The embroidery is tight enough to withstand the roughest ride, and the salves are of the finest quality I have ever seen. You have a profound talent, ma'am. You understand the very heart of what this land requires." The announcement of her victory rang out over the crowded fairgrounds. The blue ribbon was pinned to her simple charcoal dress with a flourish. A wave of genuine applause erupted from the onlookers. Even the most skeptical ranch wives nodded in appreciation of her tangible, useful skill. The sneer of Arthur vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned, humiliated silence. The crowd turned away from the cruel family, their focus now entirely on the woman who had proven her worth in the open light of day. Evelyn stood in the center of the square, her head held high. She was not the useless, broken widow the family had cast out. She was a woman of talent, of resilience, and of place. She felt the heavy, beautiful weight of the blue ribbon against her chest. She had earned her validation, and she had done it with the quiet grace that defined her very existence. Gideon stepped to her side. He did not touch her, yet his presence was a constant, warm current against her skin. He offered her a look of such raw, unadulterated pride that she felt her knees weaken. "You are the queen of this prairie," whispered the giant, his voice low and intimate amidst the roar of the fair. "They see it now, just as I have always seen it." The triumph of the afternoon was sweet, but the peace of the day was destined to be fleeting. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, orange shadows across the dusty square, Gideon moved toward the wagon to prepare for the trip home. He stepped into the quiet space between two large crates of feed. Arthur trailed him, waiting for the crowd to thin. The brother-in-law stepped forward, his face flushed with the lingering remnants of his embarrassment and a new, sharp edge of malice. He waited until Gideon stood with his back to the bustling activity of the stalls. "You think you have won, mountain man," hissed the brother-in-law. His voice was a low, jagged whisper that did not reach the ears of the passing townsfolk. "You think you can play the hero and walk away clean? You are blinded by your own arrogance." Gideon turned slowly, his face a mask of bored indifference that masked the coiled spring of his potential violence. "Leave, Arthur. You are done here." "I am not done," countered the brother-in-law. He took a predatory step closer, his eyes glinting with a dark, dangerous secret. "You believe you have shielded that fragile woman from the truth of your own history. You believe your hands are clean. But I have spent these weeks digging into the past you so carefully buried beneath these mountains." The mountain man stood perfectly still, but the air around him seemed to grow heavy with static. "I know what happened to the men who rode with you during the war." "Gideon," taunted the brother-in-law, "I know the dark debt you carry. If you do not walk away and leave the inheritance, and if you do not force that woman to leave your side, I will tell the entire valley exactly why you chose to live in this isolation. I will reveal the blood that stains your soul." The brother-in-law offered a thin, cruel smirk, satisfied by the sudden, rigid posture of the giant. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the growing shadows of the fairground. Gideon remained in the narrow space between the crates, his gaze fixed on the retreating form of his enemy. His face betrayed no emotion, but his hands clenched into tight, scarred fists at his sides. The secret he had kept locked behind the heavy walls of his heart for years was no longer his own. What horrific shadow from the past did the cruel brother-in-law hold over the man who had given everything to save the widow? The vibrant colors of the fairground seemed to bleed into a muddy, muted gray as the sun slipped below the jagged horizon. Evelyn sat upon the wooden bench of the wagon, her hands resting motionless in her lap. The blue ribbon pinned to her charcoal dress felt heavy, a sudden, sharp reminder of the pride she had felt only hours ago. Now, that pride was being slowly eroded by a corrosive, silent fear. Gideon was preoccupied. He moved with a stiff, unnatural efficiency, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line as he prepared the draft horses for the return journey to the valley. He did not look at her. He did not offer the usual, gentle touch or the reassuring gaze that had become the anchor of her existence. He was a statue carved from granite, cold and unapproachable. While the mountain man secured the heavy leather traces, Arthur approached the wagon. The brother-in-law moved with the slithering grace of a snake, his face twisted into a mask of false sympathy. He leaned against the side of the wagon, his voice a low, calculated rasp that carried just enough volume to reach the ears of Evelyn, but not the preoccupied giant. "You look troubled, dear sister," whispered Arthur. His eyes held a flicker of dark, malicious triumph. "Perhaps you have realized that a man such as he does not save a woman for nothing. It is a harsh truth to learn, but it is necessary. You believe he is a knight, but he is merely a collector of debts." Evelyn turned her head, her hazel eyes wide with a flicker of defiance. "He saved me when you cast me aside. He asked for nothing in return." Arthur laughed, a hollow sound that lacked any genuine warmth. "He asked for nothing? You are naive." He knew. He knew about the inheritance of your aunt long before the train arrived at that station. He watched the movements of our family for months. He is a man of the mountain. Yes, but he is also a man of calculation. Why do you think he chose to rescue you? Was it out of the goodness of his heart, or because he saw a way to secure a fortune without needing to toil in the dirt for it? Ask yourself why a man who prides himself on his isolation would suddenly seek a wife. The words struck the fragile heart of Evelyn like jagged stones. She wanted to deny the accusation. She wanted to scream that the man who had built a garden for her, who had defended her honor, and who had stood before a magistrate to bare his soul, could not be motivated by such greed. Yet, the seeds of doubt were already taking root. The silence of Gideon, his abrupt shift in mood, and the mysterious way he had arrived in her life all began to swirl in her mind, twisted by the poison of the words of Arthur. "You lie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do I?" Arthur leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "Watch him tonight. Watch how he reacts when the shadows grow long. He is hiding a darkness, and you are simply the key he used to unlock his future. You are not a queen, Evelyn. You are a transaction." Arthur stepped back, fading into the crowd, before Gideon returned to the bench. The ride home was an agonizing exercise in silence. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons with a mournful, wailing tone that mirrored the turbulence within the chest of the widow. Evelyn sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She watched the profile of Gideon, searching for a sign, a glimmer of the man she thought she knew. But his gray eyes were fixed on the road ahead, burning with a fire that she could not interpret. Was it the rage of a man protecting his secret? Or was it the frustration of a man whose game had been exposed? The doubt festered. It grew like a shadow in the corner of a room. Every time he shifted in his seat, she wondered if he was calculating the worth of their union. Every time he remained silent, she interpreted it as the cold indifference of a man who had already obtained what he desired. The beautiful trust they had forged, the delicate threads of affection they had woven together, felt as though they were unraveling before her eyes. When they reached the estate, the sky was bruised and angry. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, ominous warning. Gideon unhitched the horses with a frantic, desperate energy. He did not invite her into the house. He did not offer the usual, gentle guidance. He walked to the barn and returned with a saddle, his movements sharp and precise. Evelyn stood on the porch, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She watched him throw the saddle onto the back of his largest, strongest horse. "Where are you going?" she asked. Her voice was small, barely audible against the rising gale. Gideon stopped. He turned to look at her. The moonlight, breaking through a rift in the clouds, illuminated the harsh lines of his face. He looked exhausted, haunted, and strangely distant. He did not speak. He did not offer an explanation for his sudden departure, nor did he provide comfort for the distance that had grown between them. He looked at her with a profound, aching sadness that she could not comprehend. He mounted the horse. The animal snorted, sensing the agitation of its master. "I must go," he rumbled. The words were heavy, devoid of the gentle warmth she had come to expect. "You are leaving." Evelyn felt the icy grip of abandonment closing around her throat. The words of Arthur echoed in her mind. He is a man of calculation. Gideon looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He seemed as though he wanted to say more, as though 1,000 words were trapped behind his clenched jaw. But he only tightened his grip on the reins. He kicked the horse into a gallop, the beast thundering away from the house and into the dark, encroaching storm. He did not look back. Evelyn stood alone on the porch as the first drops of rain began to fall. The cold water soaked into her dress, but she did not move. She watched the darkness swallow the silhouette of the man she had begun to love. The house, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. She was left alone with the crushing weight of her uncertainty. Had she been a fool? Was the entire foundation of their marriage built upon a foundation of sand and greed? She retreated inside, the silence of the great room deafening. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her solitude. She went to the master bedroom, the space that had become their shared haven. She touched the pillow where he had slept, the fabric still warm from his presence. She felt the sharp, jagged edge of jealousy and fear. If he was truly motivated by greed, would he return now that the papers were signed? Or was he already planning his next move? Perhaps even a life without the burden of a wife he had only married for an inheritance. The storm intensified, the wind shaking the heavy timber of the house. Evelyn sat on the floor near the bed, curling her arms around her knees. She was the queen of the prairie, yet she felt like a discarded child. The doubt was a living thing now, consuming her thoughts, twisting her memories, and poisoning the very air she breathed. She waited through the long, agonizing hours of the night. She listened to the rain lashing against the glass, waiting for the sound of hooves that did not come. The fear of loss, which had once been a distant specter, was now a tangible, suffocating reality. She realized, with a sinking heart, that she would rather have known the truth of his greed than to suffer the agony of this agonizing, unexplained absence. Was she merely a pawn in a game she could not see? Or had she lost the only man who had ever made her feel worthy of love? The storm raged with a primal, suffocating fury. Thunder shook the heavy timber walls of the great room, the deep vibrations rattling the fine china stacked within the cupboards. Evelyn paced the length of the wooden floorboards, her heart a frantic bird trapped within the cage of her ribs. Every flash of lightning illuminated the empty space where the massive mountain man had stood only hours before. The uncertainty was a physical weight, a dull ache that eclipsed the cold rain lashing against the window panes. She stopped near the window. The darkness outside was absolute, broken only by the chaotic flicker of the lightning. Suddenly, a strange, jagged orange glow pierced the gloom on the far eastern slope of the valley. It was not the white strike of lightning. It was a low, hungry light that pulsed with a rhythm entirely its own. The heart of Evelyn skipped a beat. A massive, dry lightning strike had ignited the brush near the outer fences of the ranch. Panic flared, sharp and instantaneous. She rushed to the heavy oak door and pulled it open. The wind slammed into her, carrying the thick, acrid smell of burning pine and dry grass. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, licked by the high winds and fed by the parched landscape. If the flames reached the barn, the entire estate would be lost. Evelyn did not hesitate. She did not retreat to the safety of the house. She grabbed the heavy woolen coat of Gideon from the wall hook and wrapped it around her shoulders. She stepped out into the tempest. The 3 ranch workers had already emerged from the bunkhouse, their faces pale and illuminated by the growing glow of the fire. They stood paralyzed, the sudden absence of the commanding presence of Gideon leaving them adrift. They looked toward the empty barn, then toward the fire, their movements sluggish and uncertain. Evelyn ran toward them, her boots sinking into the mud. She reached the group and grabbed the arm of the youngest worker, the man whose life she had saved only days before. "The fire is heading for the barn," she commanded. Her voice was steady, resonant with an authority that cut through the howling wind. "We cannot wait for him. We must act now." The workers turned to look at the widow. They expected to see a fragile, terrified woman. Instead, they saw a woman whose eyes were wide with determination, and whose posture was as rigid as the mountain itself. She was not a victim. She was the mistress of the valley, and her home was under attack. "Grab the spades and the heavy burlap sacks," she continued, her gestures sharp and purposeful. "We will dig a firebreak along the ridge line. We can contain it if we move now." The men did not question her. They did not pause. The transformation of the widow, from a delicate guest to a fierce protector, ignited their own resolve. They sprinted toward the barn to secure the tools. For the next several hours, the world became a blur of smoke, heat, and physical agony. Evelyn worked alongside the men, her delicate hands ignoring the burning friction of the shovel handle. The smoke scorched her lungs, and the biting wind whipped her hair across her face. But she felt no fatigue. She was fighting for more than just the timber and stone of the estate. She was fighting to prove that she belonged here, that she was worthy of the life the mountain man had offered her. She directed the men with a calm precision that defied her own racing terror. She identified the path of the flames and ordered the formation of the firebreak. When the wind shifted, threatening to push the wall of heat toward the house, she was the one who rallied the workers to soak the wooden roof of the barn with the last of the well water. She was covered in soot, her dress torn, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion. But as the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the fire sputtered and died against the barrier they had created. The flames retreated, leaving behind a scarred, blackened line of earth that stood as a testament to their labor. The adrenaline left her body as quickly as it had arrived. Evelyn sank to her knees in the mud, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The workers gathered around her, their chests heaving, their faces etched with newfound respect. They did not see the fragile widow anymore. They saw the heart of the ranch. "We saved the house, ma'am," the scarred worker said, his voice husky with emotion. He reached out to help her to her feet, his touch gentle and deferential. "We could not have done it without your direction." Evelyn nodded, unable to summon the breath to speak. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to touch the jagged peaks. The valley was silent, save for the crackle of smoldering timber. The ranch was safe. The home was intact. But the emptiness in her chest remained. The fire had been defeated, but the man who should have been leading the defense was still missing. She turned toward the house, her steps heavy and leaden. She walked into the great room, the space once again feeling like a cavernous, empty tomb. She collapsed into the rocking chair by the hearth, the exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. She must have drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, for the sound of the front door groaning on its hinges startled her awake. The morning light was full and bright now. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was a sight of ruin. His clothes were soaked and torn, stained with the dark mud of the mountain trails. His face was unshaven and pale, his eyes rimmed with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He moved with a limp, his body listing to one side as if he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. He did not speak. He did not ask about the fire or the state of the ranch. He simply walked into the room, his movements sluggish and slow. He carried a strange, heavy wooden lockbox beneath his arm, his grip on it white-knuckled and tight. Evelyn stood, her hands trembling. She wanted to run to him, to demand to know where he had been, but the sight of his exhaustion and the dark, haunted look in his eyes held her rooted to the spot. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the soot-streaked ruin of her dress, the dirt on her face, and the remnants of the exhaustion that still clung to her frame. A flicker of something crossed his face, not relief, not happiness, but a raw, agonizing sorrow. He set the lockbox upon the heavy oak table between them. The wood made a dull, final thud. "I have returned," the mountain man murmured. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual resonance. He did not reach for her. He did not offer a comforting touch. He simply looked at the lockbox, his breath hitching in his chest. Evelyn stared at the box. It was crafted from dark, polished mahogany, its edges reinforced with tarnished brass. It looked ancient, heavy with the weight of years and secrets. It was not a treasure chest. It looked more like a vessel for things better left buried in the dark. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gideon looked up, his gray eyes piercing her own with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. He did not answer. He only placed his hand upon the lid of the box. His fingers splayed across the brass. "This holds the answer to the secret that keeps me from being the man you deserve," he whispered. He leaned forward, the exhaustion visible in the slump of his massive shoulders. But his gaze remained locked on hers, pleading and afraid. The box sat between them, a silent arbiter of their future. Everything she had suspected, everything she had feared, and everything she had hoped for was contained within the small, dark space. The storm had passed. The fire was extinguished. But the true test of their bond was about to begin. He turned the small brass key that hung from a leather cord around his neck, the metal clicking against the wood with a sound like a heartbeat. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents that would either shatter their sanctuary forever or finally set them free. The lid of the mahogany box groaned against the rusted hinges. Within the velvet lining lay a single, thick stack of legal documents tied with a ribbon of faded black silk. Gideon did not touch the papers. He let his hand drop to his side, his fingers trembling with a sudden, uncontrolled spasm. The exhaustion finally breached the wall of his resolve. He swayed on his feet, his massive frame lurching forward. Evelyn dropped her guard completely. She rushed to the side of the mountain man, catching his weight before he could collapse onto the hardwood floor. His duster coat felt stiff and heavy against her palms, and the faint, unmistakable smell of charred wood and burnt hair drifted from his clothing. "You are injured," breathed the widow. She guided him to the heavy timber table. He sank onto the bench, his head hanging low, his breathing ragged and shallow. Evelyn did not wait for an invitation. She moved with the practiced, efficient speed of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring for others. She retrieved the iron kettle, filling it with fresh water, and gathered the clean linen cloths from the pantry. As she worked, she caught sight of the sleeve of his flannel shirt. The fabric was seared away, revealing the skin beneath. Angry, red blisters marred the powerful forearm of the giant. He had been burned by the heat of the fire while he fought his way through the storm to return to the ranch. She peeled back the ruined cloth with the utmost care. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of sorrow and guilt. He had not abandoned her. He had endured the burning furnace of the landscape to reach her. "Why did you risk your life to return in such a storm?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, the raw emotion thick in the quiet room. Gideon looked up, his gray eyes cloudy with pain and a deep, weary ache. He did not possess the strength for the usual silence. "I heard the thunder," rasped the giant. "I knew the dry timber of the valley would ignite. I could not stay away, knowing you were alone in the path of the flames. My life is of no consequence if your safety is not assured." The admission hung in the air, a simple, devastating testament to his devotion. Evelyn felt the walls around her own heart fracture. She dipped a clean cloth into the cool water and pressed it gently against the burn on the arm of Gideon. He hissed, his muscles tightening, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, her movements delicate and reverent. She applied the soothing salve she had crafted in the winter months, the very same salve that had brought her the blue ribbon at the fair. The scent of lavender and healing herbs filled the space, masking the harsh smell of the fire. As she wrapped the linen bandage around his arm, her fingers brushed against his skin. The heat of him seeped into her, a grounding, solid warmth that she had desperately craved during the long, terrifying hours of the night. Gideon reached out with his uninjured hand. He touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the soot-streaked curve of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, as if he expected her to recoil. "I have carried the secrets of the past for a long time," murmured the mountain man. His gaze moved over her face, searching for a sign of judgment. "I was afraid that if you knew the weight of what I have done, you would see only the darkness and not the man who desperately wants to be the light in your life." Evelyn felt the sudden, desperate urge to lean into his touch. She wanted to rest her head against his massive chest and surrender the exhaustion of the past few days. The near confession was right there, trembling on the edge of his lips. He was offering her the truth of his history, the very thing she had been terrified to ask for, and the thing he had been terrified to give. "I do not care about the past," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I only care about the man who stands before me now." The eyes of Gideon widened. He seemed to hold his breath. The air in the room suddenly charged with a profound, magnetic intimacy. He leaned closer, the distance between them closing until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. It was the moment of the near confession, the turning point where the distance between the king and queen of the prairie would finally vanish. But then, the sunlight caught the stack of papers resting in the open mahogany box. The sight of the documents brought the cold reality of the legal deadline crashing back into the warmth of the room. The inheritance, the greed of her former family, the accusations of coercion, the suspicion that had festered in her mind during the long, dark night of the storm suddenly flared to life again. She pulled back, her hand falling from his arm. The moment of vulnerability shattered, replaced by the sharp, defensive cold of her lingering doubt. "The inheritance," she said, her voice turning brittle and formal. She gestured toward the box. "If the deadline arrives tomorrow, and the papers are not in order, they will still claim the estate. They will still claim that the marriage is a fraud." Gideon froze. The light in his gray eyes dimmed. The tentative hope he had dared to harbor, retreating behind the familiar fortress of his stoic expression. He pulled his hand away, the distance between them stretching wide and impassable once more. "The papers are in order," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of the previous intimacy. "Everything is prepared for the arrival of the magistrate tomorrow morning. You have nothing to fear from them." Hode. He stood up, the movement jarring and abrupt. He gathered the bandages and the salve, his actions efficient and distant. The tenderness that had defined the last hour was replaced by the rigid, impenetrable duty of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation. Evelyn watched him walk toward the door of the bedroom, his limp pronounced and heavy. She wanted to call out to him, to take back the words that had chased the warmth from his eyes. But her tongue felt like lead. The fear of being a pawn, the fear of the secret he kept, and the encroaching deadline for the inheritance claim formed a barrier she did not know how to cross. She stood alone in the great room, the silence of the valley pressing in on the house from all sides. The box sat on the table, the black ribbon untied, the papers waiting for the morning sun. She knew that when the sun rose, the deadline to claim or forfeit the vast fortune would arrive. She would be forced to choose between the safety of the inheritance, which offered her independence from the man she had begun to love, and the risk of trusting a man whose past remained a locked room she had yet to enter. The morning light would bring the end of the waiting. The truth would be laid bare, and the future of the ranch and their hearts would be decided in a single, irrevocable hour. How could she possibly choose between the life she had been promised and the truth of the man who had risked everything to keep her safe? The morning sun crawled slowly over the jagged crests of the mountains, painting the valley in shades of brilliant gold and deep, cooling violet. The air inside the great room remained stagnant, heavy with the weight of the coming hour. Evelyn stood by the cold stone hearth, her gaze fixed upon the mahogany box sitting on the table. Beside her, Gideon sat upon the wooden bench. He was a man composed of shadows and raw fatigue, his bandaged arm resting upon the table as if the limb were made of lead. The rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels announced the arrival of Magistrate Vance. The sharp-featured man stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the two occupants with a clinical, detached precision. He carried a fresh stack of legal papers. The brother-in-law, Neff, Arthur, trailed behind the official, his expression twisted into a smirk of absolute, smug confidence. He clearly believed the deadline would bring the defeat of the mountain man and the return of the widow to his own cruel control. The time for the final determination has arrived, stated the magistrate, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The deadline for the inheritance claim expires at noon. I am here to facilitate the final transfer of assets or the dissolution of the marital union, depending upon the evidence presented. Arthur stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with greed. The proof is simple. Magistrate, the widow is a fragile, unstable woman. The man has isolated her to exploit the fortune. It is a theft, plain and simple. We have the legal documents proving the debts of the estate of the late husband. She cannot inherit while those debts remain unpaid. We demand she be returned to the city to be placed under proper care. Gideon did not rise. He did not shout. He reached out with his uninjured hand and slid the heavy mahogany box across the table toward the magistrate. The debts of the estate are not the business of the family, rumbled the voice of the giant. They are the business of the creditor. The magistrate frowned. He opened the box, his fingers brushing against the ribbon of black silk. He withdrew the documents. His eyes flickered over the pages, his expression shifting from detached professionalism to profound, stunned silence. He turned the pages. One by one, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Evelyn watched the face of the official, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Gideon. He was not looking at the magistrate. He was looking at her. His gray eyes were soft, filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. These documents, murmured the magistrate, his voice trembling slightly, are the deeds of full satisfaction. Every single debt, every single lien, every single claim against the estate of the late husband has been entirely paid in full. Arthur froze. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of sudden, violent confusion. That is impossible. She had no money. The estate was bankrupt. The money did not come from the estate, continued the magistrate, looking up at the towering rancher. It came from the personal fortune of the man who sits before us. The total sum is staggering. You have spent your own wealth to secure the financial freedom of this woman. The room went deathly silent. Evelyn felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked at the papers, then back at Gideon. The near confession he had offered the night before, his fear of being seen as a man of calculation, the secret of his past, it all rushed together into a single, overwhelming truth. He had not married her for the inheritance. He had spent his own vast, hard-earned wealth to buy her absolute liberty from the people who had tortured her. He had secured her future by sacrificing his own. Why? Whispered Evelyn. The word was a fragile, broken sound in the heavy air of the room. Gideon did not answer immediately. He looked at Arthur, whose face had turned a sickly, pale gray. The brother-in-law sputtered, searching for a legal loophole that no longer existed. The magistrate held up a hand, effectively silencing the man. The legal claim of the family is hereby voided, declared the magistrate, the authority of the law ringing in his words. The widow Evelyn owns the assets, and she owes nothing to any other party. The marriage is fully validated. The case is closed. Arthur turned on his heel and fled the room, his arrogance shattered by the cold, hard reality of the documentation. He did not look back. He did not offer a word of apology. He simply disappeared, leaving the ranch forever. The magistrate gathered his belongings and bowed to the couple. His demeanor transformed into one of genuine, quiet respect. He stepped out of the great room, leaving the husband and wife alone in the sudden, expansive silence. Evelyn walked slowly to the table. She looked down at the papers that represented her life. They were no longer the chains of an inheritance. They were the map of her total freedom. She could walk away right now. She could go back to the city, use the wealth to build a life of comfort and safety far from the wild, dangerous peaks of the mountain. She would never have to lift a heavy bucket or face the fear of the winter cold again. She looked at the arm of Gideon, still wrapped in the white linen she had applied the night before. The soot from the fire had stained the bandage, a mark of the sacrifice he had made to return to her. "You spent your fortune," she breathed, the realization echoing in her chest with a physical ache. "You did not want the money. You did not want the land. You wanted to make sure they could never touch me again." Gideon stood slowly, his movements hindered by the pain of his burns. But he did not look away. "I did not want you to live in fear. I did not want you to ever feel the need to beg for your own dignity. If the price of your peace was the wealth I had hoarded to keep myself safe, it was a price I paid gladly. The emotional barrier that had kept them apart, the fear that had dictated their every move, had been demolished by the sheer weight of his devotion. She was no longer a ward. She was no longer a queen by title alone. She was the woman who had been loved so deeply that the man who loved her had offered everything he possessed to set her free. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand upon the papers. She did not need them. She did not care about the gold or the holdings of the late husband. She cared about the man who stood before her, bruised and weary and undeniably hers. "The inheritance is yours to do with as you wish," stated Gideon, his voice low and devoid of expectation. "You are free, Evelyn. You have no obligation to this house. You have no obligation to me." He turned away, moving toward the window, his posture slumped with the terrifying expectation of her departure. He had secured her freedom, but in doing so, he had invited her to leave him. Evelyn looked at the documents. She picked them up, the edges of the heavy paper crisp beneath her fingers. She walked to the hearth, where the dying embers of the morning fire still pulsed with a faint, warm glow. She held the papers above the heat. "I have everything I require within these walls," she whispered. She let the papers drop. The fire caught the edges instantly, curling the parchment into black, dancing ribbons of smoke. The inheritance, the legal ties, and the fortune of the past vanished into the light of the morning. Gideon turned, his eyes wide, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the hearth, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Why?" he breathed. Evelyn stepped across the room. She stood before him, the distance between them gone. She did not reach for his hands. She reached for his heart. She saw the man who had been terrified of his own capacity for love, the man who had hidden behind the walls of his isolation. And she knew that the time for secrets and distance was over. But as she looked up into his eyes, she realized the final, lingering shadow of his past remained. The threat Arthur had made, the secret about the men who had ridden with him during the war. It was still there, a ghost waiting to be named. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers interlocked with his, their skin burning with the intensity of the moment. You have given me my life, she murmured. Now, tell me the truth of yours. Let the past fall away, just as those papers have fallen away. Gideon pulled her close, his massive frame shaking with the depth of the release. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he prepared to surrender the final piece of his guarded soul. The truth was ready to be spoken, but as he opened his lips to begin, a sound from the porch signaled that their solitude was about to be interrupted. The knock at the heavy oak door was soft, tentative, and utterly unlike the harsh intrusion of an enemy. Evelyn stepped away from the chest of the mountain man, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and lingering anticipation. She walked to the entrance and pulled the door wide. Standing on the porch were the 3 ranch workers, their faces scrubbed clean, their hats held reverently in their hands. The youngest man, the one whose life she had saved in the depth of the winter, stepped forward. He held a small, beautifully carved wooden box. We heard the arrival of the magistrate, the young man murmured, his eyes fixed upon the floorboards. We wanted to welcome the lady of the house properly. You are the heart of this valley. We are honored to serve. He placed the box into the hands of Evelyn and bowed. The 3 men retreated as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the porch empty and the morning air filled with a profound, quiet grace. Evelyn returned to the great room. Gideon stood near the hearth, the dark weight of his secret still pulling at the lines of his face. She set the gift aside and returned to him, taking his hands in hers. The touch of his skin against hers was the only thing that mattered in the vast, silent house. The interruption is gone, she whispered. Tell me the truth of your soul. Gideon looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers for the strength he doubted he possessed. He took a long, shuddering breath, the air whistling through the rugged expanse of his chest. I was a captain, he began, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the embers. During the war, I led a company of young men across a precarious bridge to secure a supply line. The enemy arrived in force. I realized the only way to save the village on the other side of the river was to destroy the bridge before we reached safety. I gave the order to blow the charges. I saved the village, but I left 30 of my own men on the other side. They did not survive. The confession hung in the air, raw and jagged. It was not a tale of malice, but of the crushing, impossible burden of command. He had carried the ghosts of those 30 men for years, convinced that his own life was a debt he could never fully repay. I came to these mountains to hide from the judgment of the world, he continued, his eyes glistening. I believed that if I lived in isolation, if I never allowed myself the happiness of love or the comfort of a home, I might eventually balance the scales. I thought I was unworthy of a queen because I felt like a failure of a man. Evelyn listened to the broken confession of the man who had been her sanctuary. She did not see a monster. She saw a soul who had made an impossible choice to save others. A man whose burden of conscience was the ultimate proof of his goodness. She stood on her tiptoes, pressing her forehead against his chest. You did not fail them, Gideon. You chose the lives of the innocent over your own peace. That is the definition of a protector. You have been carrying a sentence you never deserved. The mountain man let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. The tension that had held his body in a rigid, impenetrable cage for years finally shattered. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close to his heart. The barrier of his guilt, the wall he had built to keep the world at bay, crumbled into dust. He wept not for his lost men, but for the relief of finally being known, and finally being forgiven. In that embrace, The last shadow of the past dissolved. The man of the mountain and the woman of the valley stood as equals, bound not by legal contracts or inheritance, but by the shared recognition of their own inherent dignity. The wind blew soft and warm through the open door, carrying the scent of spring flowers and the promise of a life unburdened by fear. The ranch was no longer a fortress, it was a home. The silence that filled the great room was no longer cold and empty. It was the quiet, peaceful hum of a life beginning in earnest. As the years passed, the estate of the Weeping Peaks transformed. The rough-hewn timber was softened by the gentle touch of the widow. The garden beds, built with such silent devotion, burst into a riot of color every spring, feeding the community and serving as a testament to the care of the woman who had once been cast aside as useless. The story of the towering mountain man and the queen of the prairie became a legend in the valley. People spoke of the way the giant walked with his wife, his massive hand always resting protectively upon her back. They spoke of the way she stood tall, a beacon of grace and unwavering strength, the undisputed heart of the wild land. They raised their children to understand that true strength is not found in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to protect, to nurture, and to forgive. The inheritance had long since been forgotten, consumed by the fire that cleared the path for their true life together. The gold was gone, but the legacy they built was more enduring than any fortune. It was a legacy of belonging, of redemption, and of the quiet, fierce love that thrives when two souls choose to heal each other. In the twilight of their years, they would often sit upon the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The world had changed, the frontier had grown, and the valley was no longer the isolated kingdom it had once been. Yet, the peace they had forged remained, a golden thread running through the tapestry of their long life together. Gideon would look at the woman beside him, her hair silvered by time, her eyes still holding the same hazel depth that had first captured his soul. He no longer saw the fragile widow he had rescued from the train station. He saw the woman who had rescued him from the cold, dark prison of his own guilt. He would take her hand in his knuckles still scarred by the battles of his youth, and she would squeeze his fingers, her touch as steady and gentle as it had been on the day she tended his wounds. They did not need to speak of the past. The ghosts had been laid to rest, replaced by the enduring reality of a life well lived. The mountain man had crowned his queen, but, in the end, he discovered that he was the one who had been truly blessed. He had learned that the highest form of courage is not to fight alone, but to let someone else stand beside you in the light. And she had learned that the deepest form of love is not to be shielded from the world, but to be known, to be seen, and to be cherished for exactly who you are. They remained the guardians of the valley, the storytellers of a love that defied the cold, the fire, and the darkness of the past. And as the stars began to blanket the sky, they would go inside, the door closing softly behind them, leaving the world to its own devices, content in the absolute, quiet certainty of their belonging. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, names, places, and incidents described are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental.